On behalf of Windsor Law and Associates, we are honored that you, Mr. Trudeau, as the Prime Minister of Canada, decided to approach our firm to create a wampum belt for the Royal Proclamation of 2022. While there have been many inconsistencies in Canada's reconciliation efforts, our firm is confident that this wampum belt represents the important commitments made by the Canadian government to facilitate a relationship with Indigenous peoples that is one of peace and respect for the future. This wampum belt represents a renewed agreement between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government, in which Canada is taking accountability for their actions, both past and present. The symbols and colors represented within this wampum belt illustrate the important Indigenous legal systems, beliefs, culture, and traditions that can aid in this reconciliation process. While there are many issues facing Indigenous nations right now, our firm decided to focus on land rights and the water crisis. It is important to return the land stewardship to Indigenous nations as a step in dismantling colonial legacies within the Canadian legal system. This is why our firm chose to include the Tree of Peace. It represents a method in which Canada can trace the roots to the Great Law and embrace Indigenous legal orders, languages, spirituality, and distinct culture. The Tree of Peace, governed by the Great Law of Peace, devised by the peacemaker, is a critical symbol of Indigenous resistance in the discussion of land issues. In gathering under this Tree of Peace, Canada acknowledges past and present wrongdoings while simultaneously taking accountability for its actions. The Tree of Peace symbolizes an area where peace is embodied and where healing can take place between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The Tree of Peace shelters all people regardless of race or nationality and represents a start to the Canadian government to begin to value the important connection between humans and the natural environment. While the doctrine of Christian discovery is often viewed as an American phenomenon, as the Prime Minister, our firm believes that it is important for Indigenous nations to see acknowledgement from its leader of Canada for its long history of Crown supremacy, in which it has been utilized as a way to justify taking Indigenous lands and asserting its superiority. In Canada and the United States, the doctrine is rooted in domination and the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples. We also see how this operates today within the Canadian legal system, in which the onus is on Indigenous peoples to provide title, as illustrated by the Delgamuukw v. British Columbia case. Indigenous land must be recognized, and that is why we included the turtle as a symbol, as it acknowledges that the land on which we live was first inhabited by the Indigenous peoples. The turtle represents a new beginning and a renewed commitment to show respect for the land and for land preservation. The land has a strong spiritual meaning to Indigenous legal orders, and we must show that Canada understands the interconnectivity between humans, animals, and the earth. The treaty land entitlements within Canada have often failed to be honored, and fulfilling these treaty obligations, we urge you, Mr. Trudeau, to take accountability for these actions. The final symbol relating to land we included is the eagle, which has historically been used by Indigenous nations as a warning symbol for any threat to the people of the Longhouse. The symbol of the eagle in this belt signifies Canada's commitment to maintaining a peaceful relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada. It is depicted as a reminder that we will remain mindful of any threats to this renewed reconciliation between the Canadian government and Indigenous nations. The second issue we focused on was the water crisis. Our firm believes it is important for you, Mr. Trudeau, to acknowledge Canada's history of resource extraction and the consequences this has had on Earth and Indigenous communities. The symbol depicting a ship and a canoe sailing parallel to each other over water within our wampum belt is representative of the Canadian government's commitment to addressing the current water crisis through the philosophy of two-eyed seeing. The symbol of two parallel lines on this wampum belt illustrates not only the two distinct cultures and laws, but also the necessity of water. The white background represents purity, good mind, and peace, which are the Indigenous Great Law's important principles. Despite Canada having a large source of fresh water, many Indigenous communities do not have access to clean drinking water. Under Canadian law, water is protected as a human right, and yet this lack of access for First Nations people is often not viewed as a critical problem. The water crisis illustrates why Canadian governance needs to implement water rights based on Indigenous ideologies. We can no longer solely view water as a commodity and look at Earth from a worldview based on domination and resource extraction. Water is vital to survival, and it represents a strong spiritual relationship for Indigenous communities in which water is viewed as an animate being. By Canada regulating water activities such as fishing, it is preventing reconciliation and continues to marginalize Indigenous communities. This is a violation of Canada's own laws, and there is a lack of accountability. Water walking should be implemented, as it is important to reclaim the needs of the water and for Indigenous nations to reconnect their spiritual relationship with the water. Just as water sustains human life, humans hold an inherent caretaking responsibility for the waters they depend on for their survival. Prime Minister Trudeau, you promised that by 2021 there would be no Indigenous nation under a water advisory, and it is clear that this objective has failed under your leadership. There has been increased clear cutting under the leadership of Trudeau in Treaty 6 lands in Saskatchewan. Indigenous advanced systems of law and customs should be adopted regarding the conservation of land and resources. Mr. Trudeau, it is important to acknowledge that colonial systems continue to operate within Canada that further marginalize and discriminate Indigenous nations. The justice system has failed to provide justice for Indigenous people, and cases such as R.V. Stanley and R.V. Cahill expose the systematic discrimination and colonialist ideologies that continue to occur. This is not an isolated incident. Indigenous women continue to go missing and are murdered in Canada without any justice or closure for their families from the Canadian justice system. The Indian Act has perpetuated the marginalization of Aboriginal women within society, and this is evident through the unsolved murders and disappearances of Indigenous women. Underlying these cases is a narrative within Canada that has helped to naturalize Indigenous exclusion and inferiority. Indigenous humanity is often not considered. This Wampum Belt is a renewed covenant that is a small step in the work that needs to be done for reconciliation to occur between Indigenous and non-Indigenous nations. Thank you, Mr. Trudeau, for choosing Windsor Law & Associates to create the sacred Wampum Belt for the future. While there is a lot of work in progress that still must occur to facilitate reconciliation, our firm is confident that this Wampum Belt is the first step in a positive direction. Thank you.